Number of familiar faces in the audience, so I know it'll be a good discussion following the presentations of this wonderful set of panelists that Magnus has assembled this morning. And it's good, I think, to bring our gaze a little bit south in East Asia. North Korea is dominating the headlines these days, and luckily it's for the region, it's the peace phase of the North Korean approach, which seems to go in cycles, which is dominating things these days. But we need to keep our eye on the entire region. So the maritime borders of China have always been matters both of insecurity and opportunity for that country. Their attitude towards these island water spaces is typical of continental land powers. They think of that several hundred miles of water off of China's east and south coasts as a defensive barrier. Chinese air and maritime forces are to be dominant there in case of conflict, and foreign air and maritime forces are to be kept out in peacetime as matters of law and practice. From the American point of view, of course, that of a maritime seafaring world power, all international water up to 12 miles from the coast of another country is open in peacetime to maritime sea and air traffic and the sea and air forces of any country. Military surveillance operations off the coast of a potential enemy are routine, legal, prudent, and not threatening conflict. But beyond these basic approaches, there are important national interests which are enmeshed in these two different attitudes. Taiwan, which is China's single greatest national objective, lies off the coast within this maritime area. China has ambitions to extend worldwide its influence, believes it has to extend its maritime power around the world to support those ambitions, and it wants to overcome its restricted access to open waters by dominating the sea and area and the sea and airspace off its coast out to open water. And as it looks east, it sees what it calls the first island chain, hemming it in and preventing that access. The American security position in Asia is anchored on allies and partners that it reaches by air and sea in that area. It's essential to the strength of these alliances and therefore to the strength of the American position in East Asia that it have unimpeded air and maritime access to South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. That's what we call the first island chain, and as well as countries further south, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, and other countries. So the differences between the United States and China on maritime disputes in East Asia are deep and real. They're unlikely to be resolved without fundamental changes in domestic political developments in either or both countries, or by major changes in the relative military and economic performance of both countries. Now, this doesn't mean these differences will lead to conflict between the U.S. and China. I disagree completely with this Thucydides trap logic that conflict is somehow inevitable, but nonetheless, these differences will lead to a sustained period of diplomatic, economic, and even military competition and tension between the United States, China, and the other countries in the maritime borders of East Asia. Now, the East China Sea, for the moment, seems relatively stable between Japan and China, with sort of understandings reached about the meaning and the type of military and paramilitary deployments in that area. But let's turn to the South China Sea, where there is the most scope for further activity, crises, and hopefully some creative diplomacy. There are two levels of power and relationships at play in Southeast Asia. The first is the tactical level, day-to-day activities, influence, and capabilities. And then second is the strategic level of fundamental government policy, of international alignments in the region. It is at this tactical level that we hear most of the media attention. China's approach is the so-called cabbage slicing or gray area sets of activities, and it sharply ramped up these activities from about 2010. China uses mostly non-military forces backed up by military ships and aircraft to advance its authority in the South China Sea. It claims and intermittently enforces authority over economic activities, hydrocarbon resources, and fishing. It claims and intermittently enforces authority over maritime and air access, warning off foreign ships and planes when they approach Chinese-occupied features. and sends fishing and other vessels into areas claimed by others. And finally, it maintains military fortifications on the islands that it occupies in the Paracels, and it has built the infrastructure for military facilities on the 7 islands it occupies in the Spratlys, 700 miles to the south. However, at the strategic level, at the higher level, China has paid a heavy price for these aggressive activities. From about 2002 to 2010, China emphasized economic, diplomatic relations, and its overall influence with governments in Southeast Asia was strong and increasing. Southeast Asian countries exported more and more products to China. Relations with the United States and Japan, while friendly, were considered less important by these countries than were those with China, and it seemed only a matter of time before China would be able to fashion a settlement of territorial claims very much in its favor. But for a series of reasons, it began a much more aggressive set of activities since 2010 and has alarmed all the other countries with coasts and claims in the South China Sea. They have formally rejected China's encroachment on what they consider their own legitimate sovereignty claims and have turned to powerful outside countries, primarily Japan and the United States, for support. They've offered access to airfields and bases to the United States and Japan. They've increased their own spending on military forces. And the United States and Japan have responded with assistance, with increased deployments of their own defense forces and other forms of increased civil and military cooperation. So China's strategic position in the South China Sea has, in fact, deteriorated, even as its tactical situation there has strengthened. As for the United States, these last 8 years have caused a reassessment and sharpening of America's interest in the South China Sea and of its activities there. The United States has said and acts as if it's willing to share power with China so long as it is shared under commonly observed limits, the provisions of international agreements in maritime regions, such as the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, or the provision of international trade and investment agreements, such as those set up under the World Trade Organization. And the United States has decided it is not willing to cede dominance to China in Southeast and Northeast Asia based on China's physical location, its economic development, and its military power, which is the fundamental basis of Chinese advances there. And it has realized that China's actions in the South China Sea constitute a challenge to one of its vital interests, maritime and air access and freedom of maneuver, and it's taking action to support those interests. As for the countries of Southeast Asia themselves, their interests are in continued economic development to raise their national standards of living, and in autonomy in their security and diplomatic relationships, and in preserving the territory in the South China Sea that they consider to be rightly theirs. So their actions will be based on these aspirations, tempered by their estimate of the prospects for assistance from the United States and Japan and other outside countries, their estimates of the willingness of China to punish and coerce, and their general expectations about the future power balances in the region. So it's this fundamental clash of interests that is at play in the South China Sea and elsewhere in these maritime regions of East Asia. So it's a good time to consider the next phase in Southeast Asia, as we are at the start of a third phase of activity in that region. China's aggressive activities that I described that began in 2010 wound down last year in the run-up to the National People's Congress. With the recently announced consolidation of President Xi's position, China is considering the next phase of its activities along its maritime borders. And my guess is that we will see continued aggressive activities, but probably at a lower level, always accompanied by soothing assurances of willingness to talk and of peaceful intentions. China, I think, will attempt to blend the two approaches that it's tried over the last 20 years, attempting to regaining lost strategic ground while slowly enhancing tactical advantages that it can achieve. But let's turn to our panel to discuss their views. We have an excellent group to talk from quite different points of view about where future developments will lead, and I would ask the panel to come to the stage, please, and Magnus Norton of the Atlantic Council to introduce them and lead the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Admiral Bear, for that wonderful introduction and for painting that rich picture of where we find ourselves and the broad issues that is related. First of all, good morning to everyone and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Magnus Norton, the Deputy Director for the Scowcroft Center here at the Atlantic Council. And great to see everyone for this discussion on maritime security in the East and South China Sea. There's obviously an important topic that is never too far away from the headlines. I think Admiral Blair did a wonderful job describing the environment and setting up the challenges and factors that we must consider. So I'm not going to belabor that point further. I would just simply add that I think naval competition in maritime Asia and the future rules of the road there actually have global consequences, and therefore should be of interest to the entire world and certainly to our European allies and in other places around the world. So certainly this has implications that go far beyond the region and something that we should all care about. Before I introduce the panel and we launch into discussion, I just have one admin note. As you can see, we have our Mentimeter up, which is an opportunity for you here in the audience and for those watching online to interact with our discussion and with our panelists. So please go to the website that's listed and type in the code, and that will give you an opportunity to answer our questions, and we will draw from this during the discussion, and I will likely draw on some of these themes and poke the panelists with some of the themes that emerge. But with that said, we have a wonderful setup of panelists today to discuss these issues. First up, we have Dr. Sarah Kirchberger from the University of Kiel, where she directs the Center for Asia and Pacific Security. And she is a noted expert on Chinese maritime affairs and the Chinese Navy in particular. Second, we have Tetsuo Kotani with the Japan Institute of International Affairs, who's an expert on sea power in Asia, maritime security, and the U.S.-Japan alliance. And third, we have John Watts, who is a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, proud American immigrant from Australia. So he has a foot on both sides of the Pacific, and is also a noted expert on Asia-Pacific security. So I think we have a great lineup that will offer three very different perspectives and approaches to the challenges in the East and South China Sea. So with that, let's launch into discussion. And I want to start with you, Sarah.
Right.
You spent a lot of time studying and thinking about the Chinese approach to the maritime domain, and in particular the South China Sea. So what Admiral Blair painted, how does this all look from a Chinese maritime perspective?
Well, quite obviously, I'm not Chinese and can't speak for the Chinese, if there's one Chinese perspective, which I doubt. But thank you very much for the opportunity to present some ideas that I've gathered from reading Chinese analysis, for instance, and talking with Chinese experts. Well, I was asked specifically to focus on this, on Chinese perspectives, perceptions, threat perceptions, and how this might be tied to China's deterrence aims, for instance, and how it relates to the South China Sea and East China Sea. So I think my first point is we should look at the various different levels of threat perception that we can see floating around in Chinese pronouncements that influence China's maritime behavior. I should perhaps add a disclaimer. Understanding this perspective does not mean endorsing it necessarily. It just means trying to understand where the other side is coming from. I think that's very important to do. So in my view, there are three important threat perception dimensions that we should consider. One is the political ideological threat perception, the general one between the Communist Party and capitalist West, that it is seen as a challenge. The other is geostrategic or geographically determined. And the third one is a military technological type of threat perception. So I will elaborate on these 3 points in a minute. First, the first one, the political ideological rift, you could say, between China and the West is something we in the West sometimes, I think, tend to underestimate in its impact. Because the Communist Party, above all, it seems to me at least, fears subversion, infiltration, and what is called peaceful evolution of the polity of China. So Chinese leaders always point in many, many different texts and speeches to so-called hostile Western forces that are trying to split up the party, split the country, change the polity. And this is also why the regime devotes so many huge funds, such huge resources to controlling the way that the Chinese can think and express themselves. There's a lack of trust in the stability of the system. And from that point of view, the very existence of a liberal democracy on Taiwan must, of course, be seen in China as a massive challenge to the legitimacy of this regime. So the existence of Taiwan has a political, ideological threat perception element to it. The second dimension, the geostrategic and geographically determined threat perception, is related to the idea of containment that has, of course, often been brought forward as an idea against containing the communist expansion in Asia. And if you read the text by Chinese navalists such as Zhang Wenmu or Zhu Hailong and others, you will constantly find the theme that the Admiral has already elaborated a little bit on, that China is almost fenced in, encircled by the US and its allies on the first island chain. And one has to concede that this perception, if there is this political, ideological threat perception in addition, is not completely without a basis, because the proximity of the first island chain, of course, gives the allied militaries very good, fantastic opportunities to conduct surveillance operations against the Chinese military, for instance. Also, the Chinese strategists always point out that the major population centers of China are all located on the eastern coast and lie exposed and are very vulnerable to threats coming from the sea and from the air. And so this threat perception is, of course, one of the driving factors of this idea of having naval expansion. And at the same time, the first island chain makes naval expansion harder to achieve. We should also note the subsurface domain in this sense, because all the Chinese territorial waters are basically only continental shelf without direct access to the deeper oceanic waters. And all the Chinese vessels, including submarines, have to pass through heavily guarded and narrow pathways. So it's hard to achieve a credible seaborne second strike capability for China's military. So this would be related to deterrence. So controlling Taiwan, to return to Taiwan, would of course massively change this situation from the Chinese military's point of view. Controlling Taiwan would give China's Navy a springboard to the Pacific, and this would change the overall situation for China. As to the South China Sea, the strategically important installations on Hainan Island, I don't know if you have the map in your mind. Hainan Island is right at the northern rim of the South China Sea. There's the strategic submarine base located near Yulin, where China's nuclear ballistic missile submarines are located. And then there's also the new spaceport, Wenchang Space Launch Center, which is to become the Chinese Cape Canaveral, you could say. Both are located on this island, and they seem to require, from a Chinese point of view, a security parameter to guard these installations against threats coming from the sea, from the air, from the subsurface domain, mainly from the south and from the east. So the third dimension to the Chinese threat perception that I personally find very interesting, due to having worked in the shipbuilding industry before, is military technological. The Chinese, of course, are obsessed with some technological developments that they see as directed against their own capabilities, such as the Aegis combat system that enables network-centric warfare operations that the United States has shared with its allies in Korea and Japan and Australia, also in some NATO countries. And of course, ballistic missile defense, and also discussions about possible prompt global strike are themes that you can often pick up in Chinese writings. They concern the Chinese strategists. So in theory, if all these technologically ambitious programs would actually succeed, which is of course doubtful, then this would in theory end up making the American mainland invulnerable. It could threaten the validity of China's nuclear deterrent. And this would, of course, be a problem. So the idea in China is, of course, to develop a more robust nuclear triad, including a seaborne deterrent, and to conduct their own version of these programs, like develop a Chinese version of Aegis, which has already happened, and also to develop a global strike program of their own. So how are these goals, these deterrent goals, related to controlling the South China Sea? As I already mentioned, there's the thing about controlling a security parameter around the island of Hainan. So the second point would be that the South China Sea is the only deeper sea area that is directly accessible from the Chinese coastline and could be made into a sort of sanctuary for the nuclear submarine force, a sort of bastion. That is basically a concept that has been discussed widely, and I think there's much to be said for the logic behind it, and it's supported by the Chinese measures that are being taken to gain a maritime domain awareness in the subsurface, surface domain, and also in the air domain. And last, I think the space program should be seen as also a driver behind the whole thing. And it's notable, I think, that the tensions in the South China Sea markedly picked up speed when this Wenchang Launch Center was first planned and when the plan was executed. I think in 2010 the plan was determined, and then in 2013 the center was finished. So you can see it's almost the same time frame when we see rising tensions. Okay, so to sum this whole thing up, looking at the military strategic importance of these goals that China is apparently pursuing, I'm very, very doubtful that China would be willing to compromise, much less back down on what it has already done in the South China Sea. And I think legal and other considerations will not be considered as important as these hardcore security implications. So that would be my points. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and a great tour of the horizon on what's at stake for China, especially in the South China Sea. Next, let's go to Tetsuo to bring us a perspective from Japan. Obviously, important U.S. ally and a major country in the region. So, please, how does this look from a Japanese perspective?
Okay. First of all, let me thank the Atlantic Council for having me. It's a good opportunity to talk about the maritime security in Asia. And since I came from Japan, let me focus on the East China Sea situation. Admiral Blair said in his opening remarks, the situation in East China Sea seems calm. But I think that's what China expects the world to see. Their provocations are still ongoing on a daily basis. So let me explain what is really happening. And I would say the situation continues to be deteriorated. As you may know, the Chinese Coast Guard ships maintain its presence around the Senkaku Islands almost a daily basis, unless the weather is not rough. And there's a certain pattern of Chinese intrusion into the Senkaku territorial waters. I call it the 3-4-2, meaning 3 times every month, 4 ships enter the territorial waters for 2 hours. This is the fixed pattern after August 2016. And previously, it was 3-3-2, 3 times 3 ships, 2 hours. So the frequency remains the same, but the number of ships increased. And this additional ship is actually the converted naval frigate, and it is armed. And also the average tonnage of the Chinese Coast Guard ships are now 3,000 tons, whereas the Japanese Coast Guard ships tonnage is 1,000. So they are becoming bigger. So although the frequency remains the same, the challenge is now increasing. And also just recently, under the People's Congress, the Chinese Coast Guard is now under the China's Central Military Commission. So we have to expect there will be more coordination between the PLA and the Coast Guard. And I don't know whether this shift influenced the new pattern, but earlier this week, we saw a new pattern of Chinese Coast Guard. They always moved together. The 4 ships always moved together previously, but earlier this week, they suddenly split into 2 groups and made a different navigation. and it makes for the Japan Coast Guard to monitor and follow the Chinese Coast Guard ships more difficult. Basically, Japanese Coast Guard ships maintain 3 ships all the time in the Senkaku Island, but they came from the Chinese Coast Guard ships are 4, and they now split into the 2 groups. So some Japan Coast Guard also needs to split into 2, and of course it's a 2 and 1 ship combination. So it's more difficult for the Japan Coast Guard to deter the Chinese Coast Guard from entering the territorial waters. So there's although the situation seems calm, but China is continuing the increase of the challenge in the East China Sea. And plus, we witnessed the PLA activities becoming more active. Previously, the Chinese Navy maintained its operation inside the East China Sea, but more recently, they conduct operation from East China Sea to the Western Pacific, and from the East China Sea to the Sea of Japan. And also the Chinese military aircraft also show the same pattern from East China Sea to the Western Pacific, from the East China Sea to the Sea of Japan. And sometimes the PLA aircraft seems like testing their capability to launch cruise missile vis-a-vis the mainland Japan. So it is showing further threat is coming from the PLA. And perhaps behind those new change in the PLA activities, I think the Taiwan situation is the key. PLA, as the recent Taiwanese Defense White Paper shows, now they conduct almost a daily operation surrounding Taiwan. And sometimes they come from East China Sea to the Western Pacific and to the South China Sea, or in reverse. So they are doing this pressure campaign vis-a-vis Taiwan, and as a result, their operational pattern is changing, and it affects both East China Sea and the South China Sea. And also, PLA has already operated drones inside the territorial waters in the Senkaku Islands. And I think China will also try to introduce the underwater vehicle, unmanned underwater vehicle into this theater, but that will pose a different threat to Japan. So currently, once Chinese ship launch a drone, we are scrambling our F-15. But I don't think that's an effective way to monitor the Chinese drone activities. So I think we have to come up with certain effective countermeasures to this. And also, we witnessed the Chinese submarine activities inside the East China Sea and beyond increasing. So, the submarine will continue to pose a threat. And as you may know, this year, 2018, is the 40th anniversary of Japan-China Treaty of Peace and Friendship. And both governments are trying to celebrate this year, this anniversary. And we are trying to stabilize the bilateral relations. But in January this year, Chinese submarine for the first time appeared around Senkaku Islands, submerged. And we wondered why China did this when we are trying to stabilize the relations. And perhaps for Chinese, on one hand, maintaining, stabilizing overall bilateral relations, and on the other hand, continuing the provocation in the East China Sea are not contradictory. Perhaps inside the Beijing, it's totally logical. So we have to expect, as we improve our bilateral relations over this year, China will conduct further provocations in the East China Sea. So basically, the Japanese government, what the Japanese government is trying to do is continue to deny the Chinese gray zone activities, such as the incursion into territorial waters, by maintaining our Coast Guard patrol and making the diplomatic protest. And we also try to impose cost on Chinese activities. We first of all try to name and shame. We try to expose what China is doing in the East China Sea. And also we try to build up our own defense capabilities, and we try to increase the alliance cooperation. And plus, we have to expect anything can happen. So we try to establish a crisis management mechanism with China. And as it is reported, when the Premier Li Keqiang visit Tokyo in May, hopefully Japan and China will sign maritime and air crisis communication mechanism that will help the crisis management in the East China Sea. And through those measures, Japan will continue to stabilize the situation in the East China Sea.
Thank you. Thank you so much. John, you're gonna cap us off here, and again, you bring an interesting perspective from the region, but you sit here in Washington. You are our in-house expert on Pacific security. Over to you.
So I'm going to go a little bit off script here. I mean, partly just because the last two speeches were just so excellent and very detailed, and I think they just stand on their own, that I don't need to go into in depth. I want to refer to the Mentimeter behind me, because the freedom of navigation has been up since the very start and has dominated that word cloud of things people are thinking about the whole time along. And I think that's really, it's both interesting but also very telling. We in the West focus very heavily on the freedom of navigation as being a large metric of our operations and success in the South China Sea or East China Sea, in response to the island building that our colleagues from CSIS do such a good job of tracking. But I mean, freedom of navigation is inherently a tactical action. It's important, it has a great symbolism to it, but it's a tactical action. If there's one area that I think that we are, and as I say, we collectively, the West, the US and its allies, are losing out in both the South China Sea and East China Sea, is strategy. To have an effective strategy, you must have an idea of the challenges you face, of the objectives that you want to achieve, and the capability to enact those. And we have the capabilities, but we're not really clear of exactly the contours of the challenge. We have an idea of what we think it is, but I would argue we don't have an understanding of what that really looks like, or understand the real grit of where the importance is. But we certainly lack the will in many ways. And we haven't articulated what our objectives are or find a way to it. And so when we talk about security, we can talk about how many times we conduct freedom of navigation operations. We can point to the visit by the USS Carl Vinson to Vietnam, which was excellent, a really important symbolic action. Australia recently declared that they were going to increase their actions in the South China Seas. Britain has declared it's going to. The West is making a great symbolic action of responding and being present in the South China Seas and providing a deterrent. Meanwhile, we're playing the wrong game. China's been very clear on its strategy for the region with the three warfares, the hybrid approach, this idea that you can't separate security from economic and political, and I think that's where we're really losing out. I mean, to use an imperfect metaphor, a police car can patrol a neighbourhood all night long, but if it's not going where the activity is, if it's not intervening in crime, is it really having an effect on policing it? And I think that's our problem, is we're going through the actions of these activities, but the question is whether it's actually having a deterrent effect, whether it's actually assisting our allies and our network of partners throughout the region in resisting the influence and the aggression. And if it's not, then what is our objective there, and how do we go about it? The other thing when we talk about Asia is we tend to get hung up on very simple discussions. One of them is the arms race in Asia. There was an excellent piece by Evan Laxmana earlier this week on the military build-up in Southeast Asia, and when he breaks it down, the arms race is really less than the sum of its parts. There's a 10% increase year on year in Southeast Asia on military spending, but a large part of that comes from personnel. And there's a question of whether that has to do with rising incomes and the costs of personnel or the size of it. Very little of it has to do necessarily with capabilities and what capabilities it does rely to. You can, again, point to the obvious things like Vietnam's has bought 8 new combat aircraft and 6 new submarines, etc. But they're replacing very old capabilities. So the question is, are these just a modernization of capabilities they already have, or is it an actual step change in deterrent effect? Again, it's important, it's valuable, it's something that needs to happen, but I think the narrative around it, we're having the wrong conversation. And to the earlier points about Australia's declaration, we haven't actually seen that in physical form yet. We haven't seen increased operations, but in any case, Australia's going to walk a very fine tightrope between being firm to China, but then also not impacting its other relationships, its economic relationships, its other partnerships with it. Britain declared it was going to send ships through. My understanding was that ship returning from an exercise, so it wasn't necessarily a deliberate action with a deliberate message. It was, again, symbolic, but less than the sum of its parts. China, meanwhile, their approach is going to be, as Tetsu said, it's going to be less than, it's never going to, well, it's not intended to ever cross into open conflict. They have the hard power, but what they're doing isn't a hard power action yet. Certainly not soft power, I guess, to stretch the metaphor, it's kind of a firm power. There are certainly hard elements to it, but it's never meant to be so hard at which it provokes a physical or conventional response. Meanwhile, it continues to push, and unless we recognize that and go beyond just describing it and kind of symbolic responses to it, I don't think we're going to be very effective in countering it. Another great example from earlier in the week, in Vietnam, the deal with Repsol has been cancelled around the Red Emperor gas field, again from economic and political pressure, not from conventional military pressure. So from a norms point of view, is that really more important than how many freedom of navigation operations we do, ship passing by a fortified island? Which one's really going to be important to the countries in the region, to our partners and our allies and our prospective partners when they look at those, and to the private sector? When the private sector sees that happen and they decide whether or not they're going to invest in a country or the region, that's going to have a far bigger impact on their decision making than whether or not we've sent a frigate or a destroyer through a certain area. So I think we need to have a more nuanced conversation. We need to have a more realistic one. We need to recognize the actions that are happening, and where the real game is the changing of international norms, and that's happening on a daily basis. It's not necessarily getting headlines. It's really important, but it's death by 1,000 cuts. It's constant action. It's not a single action or once a month or twice a month activity where we fly the flag. That's not going to stop that constant erosion of norms, and you could argue that we've already lost so much in that form. And again, I should point out, this is not just in the South China Sea or East China Sea, it's not just in Asia. It is red lines in Syria. It is the lack of response to the shooting down of the MH17. It's the lack of a firm response to Crimea and Ukraine. This is something that the West globally is failing to do, is enforce the international norms that it promotes. And so long as we fail to do that, countries such as China will exploit the gaps. They will use things like autonomous systems where there's not a lot of international norms yet, and they will push the boundaries and the envelope as much as possible. So we can continue to do our conventional military operations, our freedom of navigation. Meanwhile, we could be losing the entire game right from underneath ourselves.
Okay, thank you. So we're gonna open this conversation up. I'm eager to take your questions and comments, but I do have a question of my own for the panel, so I'm not going to let you off the hook just yet. We'll go in reverse order to keep this interesting. So for John first, want to go back to where you started, talked about strategy and the nature of the challenge. which really is sort of first order business. What is the nature of the challenge? And it's not a philosophical question, because if we get it wrong, we invest in the wrong capabilities, we posture in the wrong way, we emphasize the wrong elements, and so forth. And in many ways, we're in uncharted waters. We have not done great power competition in the Pacific, or other places in the world for that matter too. So this is for a very long time. So in your estimate, do we at this point understand the nature of the challenge? How close are we to understanding it? And then also, how did that jive with our partners and allies in the region?
So I think we understand it in an abstract sense. I don't think we understand it in an emotional sense in ways. I mean, we talk about it, particularly here in DC at these sorts of panels. We talk about it a lot. We kind of understand the contours of it, but I'm not sure that it really resonates as to just how important it is. When it comes to strategy, when it comes to military operations or any actions, for me personally, I think it always comes down to the lowest common denominator, or the most basic element, which is human decision making. It's the individual decision making, it's collective decision making, it's what changes a person's actions. And if I can just kind of stray off for a moment, one of the most interesting policy, just as an example of the importance of policy, one of the most interesting policy decisions I've seen in recent years was actually in California, and the ability to use hybrid cars in the commuter lane. And this was, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago that this started happening. And again, going to the decision making, if you're going to buy a car, if you've got an option between one car that's $5,000 more but is going to shave 20 minutes off your commute time, and a car that's a little cheaper but conventional, which one are you going to take? The hybrid suddenly seems a lot more attractive, right? You can talk about climate change, you can talk about the features of the car, you can talk about all those big marketing things, but when it comes down to it, when the individual has a choice to make, what are the trade-offs? And so I use that analogy because for our partners in the region, we have to go back down to the basics. What is the trade-offs? If the US says, the alliance is important to us, you need to do freedom of navigations, you need to reject the overtures, don't let them invest in this piece of infrastructure, etc. That works really well at the high level kind of marketing strategy point of view. But what does it actually matter to the person or the collective individuals at the coalface? And that's what we're not thinking about. Is we do a very good job of talking up here. We don't do necessarily a very good job of understanding where it links to down here, and then how the actions have to translate, understand where we go, but understand how these important elements actually get us there. And I think that's where we really fail at the moment.
Thank you. Then on to Tetsu, you very effectively laid out the state of play in the East China Sea and some of the testing and prodding that is going on of Japanese territorial waters and airspace, and also what the Coast Guard is doing, what the Self-Defense Forces is currently doing. I love this expression 342. I'm gonna keep them on in my pocket. But you also hinted at that more could be done, or other countermeasures could be considered to more effectively face those incursions and that type of prodding. In your mind, what could some of those countermeasures be?
So first of all, we have to increase the number of our Coast Guard ships. The Senkaku Island or East China Sea is not the only problem for us. More recently, the North Korean fishing boat appeared in the Japanese EEZ in the Sea of Japan, and the Japan Coast Guard needs to address this issue. And the Chinese illegal fishing boat also appeared in the Bonin Islands, the Western Pacific, and Japan Coast Guard needs to address this issue. And we have more challenges, the oil spill, accidents, and they are all the responsibility of our Coast Guard. So when the Chinese are increasing the challenge into the East China Sea, first of all, we have to build up our Coast Guard capability more. And also, one of the big challenges today for Japan is the increase in number of scramble vis-a-vis the Chinese aircraft. And as our Air Self-Defense Force conducts scramble almost every day, that will cut the time for training, and that will cut our readiness for actual combat. So we are wondering whether we have to make a scramble to every Chinese approach to our territorial space, or we have to choose certain approaches only. Or we are wondering if there's any room for the US Air Force to join this scramble, because US Air Force is based in Okinawa. So there may be a certain collaboration between the two air forces. That's what we are now discussing. And plus, some people argue that our countermeasures are too much defensive. And some people say, maybe we have to take more proactive countermeasure. So for example, whenever China enters our waters, then Japan may have to do the same to the Chinese water. And by doing so, maybe we can send a more strong signal to the Chinese. But we are still discussing many options, and we haven't reached any consensus yet.
Thank you. And finally, Sarah, I want to go back to something that you raised, which is the space aspect of Chinese interest in the South China Sea. And this is perhaps a bit of a back to basics question, but I think it's worth it because I think this part is underappreciated. Why there? Why not somewhere else? And why now from a Chinese perspective?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I'm actually working right now on a project together with an aerospace engineer. We are studying the Chinese space program and its military implications with a view to the South China Sea. And what's important to know, for physical reasons that are basically valid for every country, the farther to the equator you can get with your launch pad, of course, the higher the payload that you can launch. This is just one of the advantages of the launch pad on Hainan. The other advantage is it has a water mass to its east. You launch towards the east because of the movement of the Earth. And if there's a water mass, then there's less risk of accidents. If something goes wrong, you don't have debris falling down on people, on villages, which happens often in China, by the way, in other launch pads. And you also have a chance to recover sensitive equipment if there's a mission failure, which can also be, of course, of strategic importance. You don't want your super quantum computer falling into the wrong hands if it falls into the water, as it happened in July 2017, for instance. So there's an interest in having a launch pad that is located on a coast facing water to the east, the farthest south as China can get, and this leaves basically only Hainan Island as the only possible place. Then there's also, if you look at the Chinese ambition, there's of course a civilian space program that's very ambitious. They want to land on the far side of the moon. They want to send a mission to Mars. And if you look at the whole mission that the plan that they've laid out, they're even talking about sci-fi ideas like having perhaps a feasibility study for a space elevator in place by 2049 or something like that. This is, of course, very highly unlikely. Even the materials don't exist that would be needed to do something like that. But the only location, if you actually were going for this sort of thing, the only location where it could be physically realized would be the South China Sea, because it would have to be almost on the equator to be on the same, on the ecliptic, basically. So these are the reasons why this part of the sea area is important, some of the reasons for the Chinese space program. So why is the Chinese space program, again, important for deterrence? Obviously, if you want to have global strike capabilities, you need the launch vehicles that can reach as far. And the only launch pad that China has that can launch the super heavy lift missiles like the LM-5 and LM-9 is also Wenchang Launch Center on Hainan, because the others, being farther north, can only launch missiles with a maximum diameter, I think, of 3.5 meters, because they have to be transported over land, whereas Hainan can be supplied from the sea on ships. So there's many basic physical reasons why it makes sense. And if you look at what the US does with Cape Canaveral, what the French do with French Guiana, it's of course natural that every time there's a launch attempt, they will try to close off part of the area to inhibit other actors coming too close, of interfering with the launch, of gathering maybe information, also being able to pick up stuff that might fall down. Yeah, so basically these would be the reasons.
Okay, fascinating. So I have one final question for the group, and then I will open it up for your question. I do want to draw from our Mentimeter back here. Obviously, lots of issues on here, but one that's mentioned is cyber, and we didn't talk much about cyber during the panel. And obviously, the maritime domain is connected and interrelated to the other domains of operations. We certainly already mentioned space, but cyber is another one that is vital for communications, for maritime industry, and so on. So what are the cyber aspects of the competition in the Asia Pacific? And John, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, I think one of the key aspects is the fact that you have a concentration of some of the most important technology developers there in production. So obviously there's a huge amount of research and development that happens here in the US, but a lot of our production of our computing equipment happens in that region, be it in Taiwan or in China. And there's a huge amount of research and development going on there. So I think as much, if not more than any other region in the world, you're likely to see some of the high-end capabilities first realized or first demonstrated there. And I think, one of the interesting things is we haven't really had a peer-to-peer naval conflict in a very long time. Even where it's been state on state, it's often been irregular, where it be fishing boats, whether it be a North Korean spy trawler or whatnot, or even confronting Libyan ships in the Mediterranean. We haven't really seen a really peer-to-peer battle where forces are using everything at their disposal to advance their aims. And so I think there's a lot of unknowns there, just because we don't know what people will bring up when they really need to. But what we are seeing is a lot of irregular activities, and cyber is perfect for irregular. It's difficult to attribute, it's difficult to track, it's difficult to defend against. And I think as China continues to increase the firmness of its operations throughout the region, as it ups the ante, I think cyber will become more and more of a possible action to complement disinformation and economic pressure and political pressure and the other tools. So I think there's a huge risk there, and we're only seeing perhaps the tip of the iceberg at the moment as to what may actually occur.
Thank you. Tetsu, over to you on the role of cyber in this competition.
I'm not so much familiar with the cyber aspect, but one thing I want to say is when the USS John S. McCain collided with a commercial ship in the Southeast Asia, there was some speculation that this might be caused by the cyber attack vis-a-vis the GPS system. And there's no evidence that this attack actually happened, but it's one possible scenario we have to prepare, and that may happen anywhere in the East China Sea, South China Sea. So that's something I think we have to prepare.
Sure, with you.
Yeah, picking up that point that you just mentioned, I agree that the danger to shipping should definitely be taken into consideration. We already have evidence of cyber spoofing in the Black Sea area. There was GPS spoofing involved that is probably caused by Russia, but there's no guarantee that something similar might not happen elsewhere. About the ship collisions, I don't know if you've seen the animated version of this second collision of the McCain in the Singapore Strait. It really looked like this. The container vessel was moving steadily at a slow speed, at a straight course, and the destroyer was coming up from behind and was really cutting into this pathway of the container vessel. It looks really strange. Of course, the investigation is probably still ongoing, and cyber attacks are very difficult to attribute in any case. It could just have been an accident, and it's not necessarily the first such case of such an attack, but it could become also a tool for attacking Taiwan, one of several tools that would be employed at the same time. So these asymmetric types of hybrid methods. And we know from Chinese writings, from Zhang Wenmu in this case, that they highly approve of what Putin did in Crimea. So there's actually an article by a Chinese naval strategist commenting on Crimea and coming to the conclusion that we should do the same thing in Taiwan. We would succeed just like Putin did, because the others would just realize too late what's going on and they wouldn't have time to react. Furthermore, it's not a core interest of NATO to defend Taiwan, just as it was not a core interest of NATO to defend Crimea. And this is the reasoning. So, yeah, in my view, cyber is definitely something that needs to be watched, just as unmanned systems and artificial intelligence developments need to be watched.
Can I just add one little piece to that as well? I mean, one of the things that we perhaps don't talk about enough is the significance of the increasing industry across Asia in the defense space. And again, I'm not a cyber expert, but my understanding is the vast majority of cyber attacks happen in the industrial and commercial sectors. So, you know, for the stealing of secrets, for the sabotaging of IP and production facilities, it's not in the conventional space. It's not how we generally think of security, but when a large portion of some of the most high-end, cutting-edge military capabilities are being produced in the region, specifically to be deployed in the region, I think we need to think downstream of that as well as to what effect does that have on the capabilities before they even get there. And so I think that's an area that really needs to be explored in a lot more depth. It's not exciting. It's not, you know, ships crashing in the night type thing, but it's a really important aspect and facet that I can't speak to in depth, but I think is really important and needs more attention.
Thank you. So with that, we want to open up for questions. So here at the Atlantic Council, we believe in the rules-based global order, and we also believe in rules-based events. And we have three. So first, wait for the microphone before asking your question. Two, make sure that it is indeed a question. And three, please identify yourself with name and affiliation before asking your question. So with that, let's say something. Yes, in the back there, please. In the back here on my left.
Thank you very much. My name is Tatsuki Miba, the Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council from Japan. I have a very simple question to Mr. Watt and Mr. Kotani. This is about Japan and South China Sea. So, as for this freedom of navigation, so far Japan has not joined it. And, how U.S. sees it. The U.S. is not happy that Japan is not there, or U.S. Thinks that it is desirable Japan join it, but U.S. understands. Japan would actually have a stable and good bilateral relationship with China, or it is rather helpful that Japan does not join it.
That's like for Tetsu and John. Tetsu, why don't you start us off?
Well, the Japanese government has already stated that we will never conduct freedom of navigation, as Americans do. But already Japan has conducted the presence operation in the South China Sea. And some Americans should welcome Japan joining the FONOPS, but some Americans are a little bit cautious about it because that may trigger a possible Japan-China confrontation in the South China Sea. So doing the presence operation by Maritime Self-Defense Force should be the appropriate way at this moment. Of course, if situation in the South China Sea becomes more deteriorated and China further militarizes the South China Sea, then not only Japan but also other maritime nations may have to consider taking a certain form of FONOPS.
So I mean, I can't speak to the American perspective per se, and I doubt that there is a singular perspective in any case. I'm sure there are some that do feel that it's hypocritical and that they should be doing it. I'm sure there's others that are highly sympathetic to, why they wouldn't, and also concerned that it may trigger something else, or that the escalatory action may have more downsides than upsides. So, I'm sure the US and any segment of the US policymaking community would welcome allies participating, but I think anyone who understands the region, understands the nuance there, also appreciates the the reasons that some countries do or don't, or some of the decision making, the factors in the decision as to whether they do or don't. As I said earlier, my bigger question is, if they did, would it really have a big difference? I mean, sure, it sends a message, but I mean, how does that change anything? It doesn't demilitarize the islands. It doesn't it doesn't change Vietnam's decision on whether or not they cancel the Repsol contract. It doesn't change, the degree to which Indonesia, beefs up in the Tuna Islands. Again, it's an important action. It's important symbolism. But my question is, what effect does it actually have in the region? And I would argue that it probably doesn't, and therefore the downsides probably outweigh the upsides.
So before we go on, Sarah, can we guess at what a Chinese reaction would be to Japan participating in efforts like that?
Of course, a very negative reaction, I think. So they would probably then increase pressure on the Senkaku Islands to retaliate for it. And as you just said, that might not even be very good because it would draw out more of your resources. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if that is actually a good idea, especially given the domestic political climate in Japan that is still, debating what to do. So it might also not be something that the population fully supports. And this would then be an opportunity again for China to also exploit these internal divisions in countries. So I'm not sure whether this would be a actual win situation. However, it might be possible to start the debate, just not actually do it, but start the debate. Maybe actually the better option, because it signals a shift that China would perhaps find negative and would try to remedy somehow, but would not actually cost Japan so much in terms of military resources. So maybe sometimes it's better not to do something and then live with the consequences, but just to signal a shift in thinking so that the other side sees, oh, maybe we've gone too far, maybe we should turn back.
Can I just add to that? I mean, for me, a far more important aspect is the work Japan's doing in maritime cooperation with ASEAN. To me, that's a far more, it might not be as flashy, it might not get as many headlines, but that's a far more important action and activity that actually may change decision-making and thinking of countries in the region. So to me, it's not the action itself, it's what are we trying to achieve and what's the best way of achieving it.
Next question. There in the back.
Thank you very much for giving a chance. My name is Satoru Nagao, Hudson Institute. My comment or question is towards Kotani-san, came from Japan, and about the proportional response toward the China. So in my idea, when China enters the territorial water around the Senkaku, how to find the place as a retaliation we can enter is a problem. So my idea, how about this is the idea. If more and more China enter the territorial water of Japan around Senkaku, more and more we can visit Taiwan under the permission of the Taiwan government. Because we need to support Taiwan, and China claims Taiwan as a part of the territory, and this is friendship visit. So I'm hawkish, I'm radical, but as one of the idea, how about this? Is my question or comment towards Kotani-san. Thank you very much.
So do you want to pick that up?
Well, I would say, of course it depends, what kind of ship you would send to Taiwan. If it's maritime self-defense force ship, that would be too much provocative, I think. Coast Guard ship, still provocative. So actually the U.S. government, the Trump administration is now considering sending naval warship to Taiwan, and there was a strong reaction from Beijing. So I think we have to expect more harsh criticism from Beijing vis-a-vis Japan. That's one thing. But at the same time, I think we can take more indirect way to engage with Taiwan. For example, our 2013 civil fishery agreement with Taiwan. I think that was a very effective approach we take. Although it is not so much provocative, but we could send the political signal to Beijing. So I think rather than making protocols to Taiwan, I think we can find a more indirect approach to strengthen our ties with Taiwan. That would be my answer.
We have a question up here in the front.
Thanks very much. Greg Poling with CSIS. So I couldn't endorse more John's point that seeing freedom of navigation as by far the biggest word up there is indicative of maybe the problems around the debate in the South China Sea here in Washington. Last Friday, the day that we had the announcement of the Red Emperor cancellation, we also did the third FONOP in a year within 12 miles of Biscuit Reef, which is a giant underscoring for our Asian partners how little good FONOPs by themselves are actually doing. So what are the other tools that the US, Australia, Japan, European partners should be doing, diplomatic, economic, etc., that can actually bring some real pressure to bear here on the Chinese? Because if in 10 years we're able to sail destroyers through the South China Sea but nobody else can operate, that's a win for Beijing and certainly a loss for our Southeast Asian partners. Thanks.
Do you want to start with John and then work our way down?
Well, that's a simple answer. Yeah, we'll be done by lunchtime. No, so I mean, it obviously, as you know, it's a complex and nuanced thing, and kind of the response will need to be calibrated to each country within the region. Each country faces its own circumstances. I mean, I go back to the old saying of all politics is domestic, and I think again, if you look at the modernization or the arms race, domestic factors in each case are far more important in each event. And I'll give the domestic one for me, the Australian perspective. You could point to the shipbuilding in Australia, the continuous shipbuilding, the new frigates, the new air warfare destroyers, and say, Australia is in an arms race with China to confront it, when really what it has to do is sustaining the industry within Australia and jobs. It has more to do with domestic political support at the next election by maintaining jobs in certain regions than it does with any strategic need to have capabilities. Not to say that they're being bought purely for that case, but I'm saying the bigger debate within Australia has more to do with the domestic and the industry side of things than it does specifically with confrontation or the capability itself. And I think that's probably true in most of the countries that you look around the region. Let's look at Vietnam, for instance. I mean, if you look at Vietnam or Philippines for that matter, obviously the Carl Vinson visiting Vietnam shows that countries in the region want the US to be engaged. They want them to have a presence there. They want to have them a part of the solution or part of the issue. But when it comes down to it, and again, I go back to my earlier point about decision making, the question is, do you, to what degree do you make a symbolic action which may be hollow, or do you, take an action which may be less savory, but has economic implications. So that we need to look at each individual. We look at, say, Vietnam and the case around the Red Emperor and say, why are they cancelling it? Is it because they're worried about losing investment in this other set of infrastructure? In which case, is that something that we can do? Can we step in and fill that void so they don't have to rely on China for infrastructure investment in a certain area? Or are they worried about certain capability? We have to look at each individual case and say, what is driving the decision making in that case? What do we want to achieve? And if it's that we want to provide them a credible alternative so it changes their decision making, then that's what we need to do in each region. I mean, it takes us obviously a very long time, and frankly, we'd all be out of a job if we could come up with it that easily. Here's the list of things that we need to, the boxes that we need to tick, and we'll be fine. But I think we need to take a harder look at understanding what is driving the political decision making in each of these countries. What individually do they need, and then what can we provide to ensure that our allies and partners and potential partners, are able to make the decisions that they want to make and that we're comfortable with. And aren't forced to take an alternative that really is only of benefit to one group.
That's it.
Well, I think the U.S. now faces a dilemma in terms of the freedom of navigation operation. You know, yes, on one hand, you have to do it, not to accept the Chinese excessive maritime claim. But as you do it, China will justify its further militarization. And the difference between the FONOPs between 2017 and 2018 is U.S. no longer confirms whether they conducted the FONOPs. But in any case, Chinese Defense Ministry announces that the U.S. conducted, and they say they have to take further self-defense measures. So yes, you have to continue, but we have to be realistic that the FONOP cannot change the Chinese behavior. I think what is needed is a red line in the South China Sea. Although the Obama's red line in Syria failed, but I think the Obama's red line in the South China Sea was successful. The red line was the land reclamation of Scarborough Shoal, and China didn't do it. And the Obama administration was quite clear on it, although their FONOP was too late. But today, there's no red line in the South China Sea. And perhaps US and its allies need to discuss what should be the realistic red line to set. And we have to discuss if China crosses that red line, what should be our collective response.
And a final word from Sarah on this.
Well, I think the FONOPs as such may not have such a dramatic effect, but stopping them would definitely have an effect, a very negative one probably, like signaling, okay, we give up. So that is perhaps not really an option. Mm-hmm. Another thing, I sometimes wonder about the real purpose of the FONOPs, I must say, apart from just demonstrating that we sail past your artificial island. In some cases, I think if you look at the timing and the location of where the ships actually conducted the FONOP, I think they may be there also to do surveillance on the Chinese activities. For instance, when the last launch of the Long March 5 missile from Hainan in July 2017 failed, for some reason on the same day there was a foreign freedom of navigation operation very near the Paracel Island that has the satellite tracking station that tracks these launches from Hainan. So this ship may have been there to gather data on the launch or whatever. And this is also an aspect that we need to, of course, consider. It's not just the signaling and the symbolism behind it. So I would argue for keeping them up because nobody else can do them. Even one British ship once every blue moon won't make much of a difference there. And that's really not an alternative to keeping them up.
I think our point is not that we shouldn't do them, it's just it shouldn't be central to the conversation. That we look at them as a silver bullet, and the metrics are often, another metric, and again, it's not a sexy topic, but another metric is we talk about, how much capability a country buys from China, and we, in DC we talk about how that shows there's an indication that they're siding with China or they're turning their line. It may just be the capability is cheaper. Again, you need to look at the decision making in each case relevant to that situation, or maybe that the restrictions of what we will sell to certain countries is being into it. So that's again something that we need to look at as an alternative. How do we provide a viable, practical alternative? Either if it's going to be more expensive, and it has to be more expensive, why is it worth them investing in a more expensive capability? I think we need to look at it on a much more calibrated scale.
I think we have time for one final question. I think the lady in the back here has been the most patient.
Hi, Jeanette Xiang from China Times, Taiwan. I'm quite interested and struck by what Sarah said, that Chinese government actually highly approve what Russian has done in Crimea, and then you link that with Taiwan. But as we know, the Taiwan Strait situation actually is quite different compared with Russia and Crimea.
Sure.
So I just would like to hear more about what the link about. Thank you.
Yeah, I was actually reporting what Zhang Wenmu, who is a very notorious, famous navalist in Beijing, has been writing. So that was his argument. that it's basically the same situation from his point of view, that, for instance, Crimea is considered a traditional territory of Russia, linked to Russia through history, and should be Russian territory again. So that was the reasoning, just like Taiwan from the point of view of China, from their point of view, from his point of view. So this is maybe one of the parallels that he's seeing. And then there's a crucial difference that he does not mention. In Crimea, there was actually a proportion of the population was actually in favor. So there were many people on Crimea actually helping the Russian invasion attempt. There were many who were opposed, but there was a sizable, lots of military people even took part in it. The situation in Taiwan is, of course, very different. There's a tiny minority only of people on Taiwan who would perhaps collaborate or help or even approve of this. So there's a crucial difference that he does not mention. But from the point of view of what the Western reaction would be, he says there is a parallel, because from the Western point of view, Crimea was not worth fighting for in the broadest sense, like we won't send soldiers to defend this peninsula. And from his point of view, from Zhang Wenmu's point of view, the same would apply to Taiwan. This is also questionable. Of course, I hope this is not true. I hope the Western countries would not see Taiwan similarly to Crimea in the same instance. I studied on Taiwan, so I consider Taiwan, of course, very important country to preserve its freedom. But the problem is that in the reasoning of some of these Chinese strategists, the cases may look very similar. And the Western countries, of course, by not doing nothing about Crimea until it was much too late, and maybe even contributing to the situation in some ways by acting unwisely before, being not consistent, we have signaled that maybe there's a chance for China to do similar things and get away with it. So this is the reasoning in the article. If you're interested in that article, I can give you, it's in Chinese, I can give you the article if you want and read for yourself. So this was what I was saying. Not that I agree with the position, I was only reporting what I read in this article.
Can I just add to that briefly, and this, I understand this is not your perspective. I think it's a highly problematic comparison for a bunch of reasons, and I think the calculation that he's making in it is wrong for a number of reasons. But I think there is an important element in that, and that is that the countries learn from other regions. We tend to look at them in little bubbles around the region, but it's not what it is. Countries observe actions of other countries elsewhere and they take lessons from it. And I think that's the point here, is that our actions in Syria, in Libya, in Western Europe, wherever they are, they're being observed and lessons are being learned. Al-Qaeda developed their plan for 9/11 in part based on its understanding or reading of US actions in Somalia on the Black Hawk Down incident. Okay, so it observed the way the Americans acted, it learnt lessons, or it thought that it learnt lessons on what that meant from American perspectives in its operations, and it developed a plan based on that. If we think that China is not watching, the Ukraine and Donbass and other places and learning lessons from the Western perspectives, then I think we're extremely naive. And similarly, I think if we think that Russia is not observing the South China Seas and learning those exact lessons, it's exactly why we at the Atlantic Council believe so strongly in the importance of a network of US alliances around the world being involved and supporting rules-based orders and values everywhere and being consistent in it, particularly for that reason, because countries from other regions will learn lessons and develop their actions based on that.
So that's all the time we have today. I apologize we didn't get to all of the questions. I think we folks had a little bit of time to hover around. So if you want to ambush a panelist, go right ahead after we wrap up. But first of all, thank you to our panelists for a fascinating conversation. Please join me in thanking them. Questions, and until next time, and thanks for coming to the Atlantic Council.